be in several different places today. I'll just let you know up front, because one thing, you're like one of the best groups I've ever been with in terms of interacting during a sermon. A lot of people you've been told to be quiet your whole life during a sermon. And we're saying, no, we want some interaction. And today especially, this is the sermon time, but in general, people would say I'm a very teaching-oriented preacher, and today even more so. So definitely want your interaction, and right from the beginning, I want you to think about the question and give me some answers. What distinguishes Christianity from all other world religions? What one thing is unique to Christianity that other religions don't have? There's a lot of overlap. What one thing is unique? Anybody know?
God is alive.
What's that?
God is alive.
God is alive. Now, they all think their God's alive. So that's, you can make that basic one. Christianity is true and the others aren't. Salvation by grace. Yeah, one thing, it's a little hard to ask these questions. If you look at the title, you should probably know what distinguishes it. But if you think about it, all other religions have prayer. Other religions have a code of ethics and morality. Other religions have maybe a belief in an afterlife. They have a holy book. They have belief, worship, all of those things. But Christianity is the only world religion that has this idea of grace, of salvation and life itself being a free gift from God versus something that you have to earn. Even modern day Judaism is legalistic. I remember asking a rabbi once, I just want to know, what's your view of how a person is saved? It's based upon living a good life. It's based upon your works. Only Christianity not only it just has grace, but that grace is essential to Christianity. And sometimes we misuse that word essential, and we use it only as in terms of important. And if you're familiar at all with football, in the game of football, a helmet is important. They're finding that out even more and more, all the concussions, and so they're working on improving the quality of the helmets. A helmet is extremely important in football. But you could play the game of football without a helmet. So it's important but not essential. On the other hand, a football is essential. You can't play football without a football. It's not football if you don't have a football. Well, that's what we're talking about with grace. It's not just important to Christianity. It is essential. It is part of the essence of Christianity. And that means to the degree that we miss grace, to the degree that we don't understand it, we understand it incorrectly, or we're not living by grace, then we're not really living the Christian life that God intends. Now, that doesn't mean you're not saved, but it does mean you're missing out on the abundance that God intends. You're missing out on what life should be as a Christian to the degree you don't understand and live out grace. And here's the problem. It's easy to miss grace. You would think because it's so essential, because it's so characteristic of Christianity, we've got amazing grace, not only the real version, there's so many other versions and songs that talk about it. It comes up. It is part of Christianity. You would think, well, surely, it's just so obvious, I couldn't miss it. Well, you might not miss that it's there, but you certainly can misunderstand it. And how do I know that's a fact? Well, you see it in the Bible. In the book of Romans, you might be familiar with it. As Paul is writing that book, you read through it, and 6 times there is this phrase in one form or the other that says, what shall we say then? What shall we say then? And oftentimes he gives this crazy idea, shall we sin all the more so that grace may abound? Sin as much as we can? And he's like, by no means. Why does Paul say that 6 times in Romans? Why does he ask that question? Well, it's because what he writes in Romans is basically what he has spoken, taught, preached, face-to-face with people. And again, the interactive element, especially of a teacher with Christians versus maybe someone proclaiming the gospel to people who aren't Christians, it was very interactive. And Paul knows every time he got to a certain point in that message and he would say something, someone would raise their hand or just shout out and say, hey, Paul, are you saying we should sin all as much as we can so grace that may abound? And he would say, of course not. Well, he knows as he is writing this book of Romans, when it's read at that church in Rome, there's going to be people that have that same question. And so I'm going to answer the question that I know they're thinking. He knows it's easy to misunderstand grace. The other reason that I know for sure it's easy to misunderstand it is because you see many of the New Testament epistles are written to counteract a misunderstanding, a distortion of grace. The Judaizers saying that, yeah, you have to incorporate works into your salvation. That was the main attack of Satan, was to undermine grace. Because it's so important, and people were susceptible to it. It's not just like, oh, no way, Satan will never fall for that. They were. That's why it's mentioned so often in the New Testament. So it is easy for us to misunderstand grace, even when it's being taught by someone as good at teaching as Paul. So I know you have some elements, some proclivities toward misunderstanding grace. We all do. Satan's trying to make sure of that. So I want to preach. I have the opportunity to preach not only this week, but in 2 weeks. And so first I was going to preach 2 sermons on grace, what it means to be saved by grace, and then what it looks like to live by grace. But as I was going over the sermon this morning, and that's when I really, I try to get all the, extras out of the way where I go off here and there and just see about how long is this sermon. I don't know. We were maybe looking at 3 hours, and I thought that'd be a little long. So I cut it in half. That's the good news. Yeah, that still wouldn't be good news. But I did cut it in half. We're going to do part 1 today of what it means to be saved by grace. In 2 weeks, we'll do part 2, and then in about a month, I'll do what it looks like to live by grace. So we're going to be talking a lot about grace. And to do that, I figure up front, you need to know what at least my preferred definition of grace is, because you hear different definitions. And you probably heard the acronym, God's riches at Christ's expense. That's a good one. There's others. One that I hear oftentimes is unmerited favor. I don't like that one because it's incomplete. My favorite definition of grace is favor bestowed when wrath is owed. That gives another element, and it's like this. If you were in your house and let's say a boy, because the second part they might be more inclined to do. A boy walks by in front of your house. You go outside and give that boy $20. That's unmerited favor. He didn't do anything. He didn't mow your yard. He didn't pick up anything. You just give him $20. That's unmerited favor. But on the other hand, if that boy walks past your house, picks up a rock and throws it through your window, and you go outside to that boy, what's he deserve? Some wrath, for sure. But instead of giving him wrath, you give him $20. That's favor bestowed when wrath is owed. Grace has that other. It's not just that we don't deserve good. We deserve bad and we get good. That's grace. And a key element of grace, and this is going to come up often, is the idea that grace isn't fair. We don't want what's fair. It would be fair to go out to that boy who threw a rock through the window and, tan his hide, I guess, as some people would say. That would be fair. That'd be what he deserved. Grace is not fair, and we're very thankful for that. So with that in mind, let's look at grace. We're talking about what does it mean to be saved, and very often, I like to look at all right, what precedes that? As you talk about being saved, well, being saved from what? Well, being saved from being lost. So we need to ask the question, before we answer what's it mean to be saved, what's it mean to be lost? What does it mean to be lost? And oftentimes for this, well, first of all, here's what it doesn't mean. Being lost is not based upon a feeling that people have. A person isn't lost because they feel lost. A person isn't not lost because they don't feel. There's a lot of lost people who don't feel lost. Maybe they don't believe in God at all, so they think they're fine. Maybe they believe in some other God that isn't really a God, so they feel fine. Maybe they believe in God and think they're a good person and feel fine. Being lost is not based on how we feel. Being lost, in the sense that it exists in the mind of God. A person is lost if God views that person as lost. A person is saved if God views them as saved. It's how God views a person regardless of how that person feels, thinks, or believes. Doesn't matter. God doesn't say, hey, how do you feel about it? It's what God views, what God knows. And lostness, then, it exists in the mind of God. What causes God to view a person as being lost?
Sin.
Sin. Exactly. When we sin, God then views us as lost. And we need to say the same thing. Sin exists in the mind of God, or at least it starts there. You know, it's not a matter of, well, I don't feel like this is sin, so it must be okay. No. What does God view it as? Sin comes from God saying this is sin or not. So once again, it's not me determining my feeling. God says this is sin, this isn't. When we sin, whether we feel like it was sin, whether we feel lost, we are lost because God views us that way. Well, then to keep going on this, can a person be saved on their own? Can a person earn their salvation? Absolutely not. Can a person be good enough to get into heaven on their own? Still seems head shaking. Not as sure, though. Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, a person could be good enough to get into heaven on their own. There's nothing in this way that we're born that makes us set from the moment of birth destined for hell, destined for eternal separation from God. We're not born lost. And so theoretically, if you never sinned, when you died, you could stand at the gates and God says, why let me in? Because I lived a perfect life. I never sinned. But of course, that's theoretically.
Babies.
Actually, no, you couldn't. Because it states in the Bible that the only way to heaven is through Jesus Christ.
The only way to heaven is through Jesus Christ for all who have sinned. And that's why it says, like in Romans, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Babies.
That tells us. But then, yeah, there's this other question. And that's why I'm doing this, because, again, grace is so prone to some misunderstandings. Paul says, for all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Have all sinned? My wife's saying a few times,
Babies.
babies haven't sinned. Well, wait, Paul just said all have sinned. Well, that's don't get me started there. We will be here 3 hours. We're not born into sin. That's a whole nother subject. But here's the thing. The Bible talks about all have sinned. How can it be that Paul says all have sinned and it's not real? Well, one thing you have to realize, and this is true of the Bible in general, the Bible uses language. The Bible is language, right? It was written in Greek, it's translated into our English, and language is like that. We speak like this all the time. There's an example. All the time. Do we speak like that all the time in some way that's maybe, isn't exactly literal, but the meaning's clear? No, sometimes we speak totally literally. 2 + 2 = 4. But we do this, and we're just used to it. If someone told you, as you were talking before church this morning, before it started, if someone says, man, I worked all day yesterday. I put in 18 hours. Would you call them a liar because they didn't work 24? Because all day is 24, right? But someone works 18, I'm not going to call them a liar. Someone works, 12, 10, 8. I'm not going to call them. We talk like that all the time. Well, the Bible is like that. We have to understand what that means. And we know from other parts of the Bible that we are not born into original sin, that children are born innocent. And it's not till you reach that age of accountability where you know right or wrong. Sin has an element of I have to know it's sinful and then do that. And so there's children in that, whatever that age is, and there's no certain age, it's when they come to that point. There are some who never mature mentally to that point. They're never at that point. But what Paul is saying, and what we understand, just like anyone who said, I worked all day yesterday, Paul says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Everyone capable of sinning has sinned. Everyone who's past that age, we're no longer under that theoretical possibility of saying to God, why let me in? Because I lived a perfect life, because we haven't. We've sinned. And not just as we think about, those bad things I've done, so many of them, so bad. James tells us, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in just one point has become guilty of all of it. Wow. That's one of those things that doesn't sound fair, does it? That's saying if you only sinned once your entire life, and maybe it was lying to your mom once you were old enough, did you eat one of those cookies I baked? No, Mom, I didn't. And you really did? This verse says you might as well have stolen, you might as well have kidnapped someone, you might as well have gossiped, you might as well have murdered someone. You've broken the whole law because you've broken it at one point. Like, boy, that doesn't sound fair. No, it's entirely fair. God is 100% holy. If we sin once, we've broken his law. We're just as guilty as we've broken all of it. And not just doing something bad, James also says in chapter 4, verse 17, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So it's not just that I do something bad. If I have a chance to do something good and I don't do it, that's sin. And I'm guilty. Ouch. Wow. That's why there's not even a question. If you're past the age of childhood, we all know we've sinned. Some of us more than once. We might be into double digits by now. Yeah, beyond that. We all have sinned. That's what makes us lost. And here's another thing. You can't make up for your sin by doing extra good things. You can't say, well, I did steal that cookie, and so I'm going to do something good that I wasn't planning on doing and counteract it. No, every time we have a chance to do good, we owe it to God to do good. So you can't miss a good thing you did and say, well, I'll do 2 good things tomorrow to make. No. Once you sin, that's it. You are lost. You can't make up for it on your own. Well, the last aspect of what it means to be lost are the effects. What happens when I sin? And there's a song, and I actually was hoping we'd sing it today, but we couldn't find a good version of it. Rock of Ages. Rock of Ages has a line that says, be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. And that song's right on, where it talks about the double cure, which implies there's double trouble, right, that we're cured from. And really there's 3 effects of sin, but 2 of them go so hand in hand, they're often lumped together, and so it's spoken of as double trouble and the double cure. The first thing that happens immediately when I sin is I become guilty in the mind of God. I have sinned. God views me as being guilty, views me as being lost because of that. And because of being lost, I now deserve God's wrath. He doesn't give it to me right away, but I deserve it. I am condemned, to be separated from God for eternity. That's what hell is when I sin. That's what will happen at the judgment. I'm guilty immediately. At the judgment day, I will be condemned to eternity separated from God based on that sin. Those 2 go together. That's the save from wrath. Save from the wrath due my guilt. And make me pure. The other aspect, the effect of sin, is I become sinful. Anyone who sins, unless they die committing that first sin, whatever it was, they sin again and again. And it becomes a habit, and even more than a habit, because it has a spiritual element to it. It has Satan working against us. It becomes a part of who we are. And so when I sin, I am guilty to be condemned. I also become sinful. So what does it mean to be lost? To be viewed by God as being guilty of sin and still owing a penalty for that sin. That's what it means to be lost. Now, there's a little foreshadowing. So with that in mind, what's it mean to be saved? Well, it's the opposite of that. To be viewed by God as having our penalty for sin paid. And once again, it's something that exists in the mind of God. A person's not saved because they feel saved. A person's not saved. There's some people who are saved, some Christians, who don't have the assurance they should have. That doesn't make them not saved. God views a person as lost. That's what matters. And what I want to look at now are what I would call the mechanics of salvation. This is going to get a little deep. So you need to be ready for it. And this is that part I'm saying. You don't have to understand it to be saved, but it helps. It's a little bit like your car. How many people here, I heard, some talk this morning before church talking about motors and mechanics and everything. And I can tell you guys understand what's going on. I don't. I don't know how a car, I don't know about fuel injectors, let alone carburetors and all transmissions. I don't know how a car works, but I'm able to drive a car. Now, would it be helpful to know how a car works though? Oh, for sure. You know, I'd like to know if that little rattle I'm hearing is something serious, or I just turn up the radio louder and I'll be okay. I'd like to know if it is something that needs attention, how to fix it. That would be good too. It would be way more helpful to be able to know how to work on that car.
Right.
Well, same thing. You can be saved without understanding what I'm going to talk about, but boy, it's helpful if you do understand it. It'll avoid some problems. And so what we're going to talk about when we talk about the mechanics of grace, of being saved, is the word righteousness. And it's one of those Bible words. You don't hear this outside of the, a church, a Bible conversation. I think maybe in the 60s or 70s you heard righteous. Hey, that's righteous. But you didn't hear righteousness even then, and you don't hear righteous much today. Well, righteousness, and the other thing that makes it difficult, righteousness is one of those words that has multiple meanings. And sometimes we look at, how am I ever going to understand it? Again, we do it all the time to talk about our language. What's the word tape mean? What's tape? Tape. This is English. We're not Greek and it's not biblical. I'm just talking tape. What's it mean? What is tape? Sticky stuff. Okay. Yeah, you got Scotch tape, you got duct tape, you got masking tape. What else does tape mean?
Videotape.
You got videotape. Yeah. An audio tape. And even then you had different kinds of that, right? You got the generation who remembers cassette tapes. You got the generation who remembers 8-track tapes. And there might be some of you who remember reel-to-reel tapes. Those were a thing for a while. So there's two kinds of tapes there. What else?
Tapeworm.
Well, there's a tapeworm. Okay, I bet you didn't have that one.
Measuring tape.
Measuring tape, exactly. There's that same word used 3 or 4 times. You want to throw in the worm. But we get by. Your mom's wrapping presents and asks, bring the tape. You don't come with a cassette. You wouldn't even know where to find one nowadays. You don't come with the Stanley pull-out measuring tape. You know what she means. Well, we need to do the same thing based on the context. We need to understand righteousness, but it means different things. Righteousness in general is conformity to a standard. You're righteous if you conform to a certain standard. Even the old, that's righteous. Well, the standard was some kind of excellence. Like, whoa, that's really good. Righteousness, conformity to a standard. God's righteousness is his conformity to his own nature. He acts in accordance with his own nature. He conforms to the standards himself, his nature. Our righteousness is where we get into a little trouble. Our righteousness, there's 2 types, and each one has 3 aspects. And if you look on that outline, I tried to line them up into columns there, so left and right. The first aspect is righteousness can be either relative or absolute. If you read through the Psalms, you're going to come across what I call one of those wait a minute moments. We're like, wait a minute. You're saying this now, but you said something different. How do those 2 fit together? Here's a couple of those passages. Psalm 97:12 says, rejoice in the Lord, O you righteous, and give thanks to his holy name. So he's saying there that those of you who are righteous need to rejoice in the Lord. Well, Psalm 143:2, talking to God, says, enter not into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. Well, it just said all the righteous are supposed to rejoice. This one says there aren't any. Wait a minute. How do those fit together? The same words being used in 2 different ways. Relative righteousness is righteousness of one person compared to another person. There are righteous people and there are wicked people, the Bible makes clear. And it's like a 0 to 100% scale. You're somewhere on there between 0 to 100, my righteousness. The Bible doesn't tell us where the line, the cutoff is for righteous and wicked. Below 50 is wicked, above 50. It's basically like a commitment to do good, and you're doing good, or someone wicked who doesn't have that commitment. But it's relative, one person compared to another. Absolute righteousness is what it's talking about in Psalm 143:2. It's absolute. The comparison there is to God. Compared to God's perfect righteousness, we either are that righteous or we're not, and we've already said no one is. There is no one who is absolutely righteous like God is. Same word, two different ways. The second aspect of righteousness is personal versus declared. My personal righteousness, which corresponds to relative, is what I have done or haven't done. I do something good, I get a little more righteous. I do something bad, I'm a little less righteous. My declared righteousness, however, is how God views me, and it's based on that absolute scale. He either views me, as we've said, as lost or saved, well, as righteous or not righteous. That make sense? One or the other is how he views me. Now, does he see my relative righteousness? That, yeah, I'm at like 77% today. Yesterday I was down at 70, but I did a lot of good things. And yeah, he sees that. But his declared, how he views us in terms of salvation, is on 0 or 100. And then there is active versus passive. Active is what it sounds like. I do something good or I do something bad. My relative righteousness goes up with good things, down with bad things. Passive, though, is the payment of the penalty. Passive is the payment of the penalty. You know, you might have heard it said someone's in trouble with the law. What's that mean? They broke the law. They did something. How do you not be in trouble with the law? Well, you either don't break it, or what's the other way to not be in trouble with the law? Well, don't get caught. There you go. For those watching, that was Greg. Do your time. There we go. All these, I go through this thinking of all the things that might come up. Tapeworm and that. Neither one of those came up. Yeah, you do your time. You pay the penalty, whatever it is, pay the fine, do your time. You're no longer in trouble with the law. Well, that's like passive righteousness. It's the payment of the penalty, the way to be righteous. So you've got these two types. You've got personal, active, relative, and you know, I tried to, what's the main one? And it really depends on where your focus is. You could call it either one. Personal, active, relative, all are on that side. And then declared, passive, and absolute, it's the other type. It's on the other column there. Which one is salvation based on? Is it based upon our personal, active, relative righteousness, or our declared, passive, absolute righteousness?
Declared, passive, absolute.
Yeah, declared, passive, and absolute. So you were saved by Jesus' death. We are saved by Jesus' payment of our penalty, not by his good life, not by the good deeds that he did being added to ours. It's not like God looks at us and says, you know what, you're at 75% righteousness, you need to be 100, I'm going to give you enough of Jesus' good deeds to get you up to 100. And you laugh at that, but a lot of people think that. Whether they ever have thought about it in this detail, that's how they think salvation, that's how they think grace works. And this is the place where if you don't know that's wrong, it can cause some big problems. And here's what I'm talking about. I remember hearing this illustration about grace. Growing up, maybe once I got to college really, is where I heard this idea of grace. You know, trying to be saved in grace versus works. Trying to be saved by your own works would be like trying to swim from California to Hawaii. That's impossible. It is 2,647 miles from California to Hawaii. She says, yeah, no problem. The world record, apparently you haven't gone for the world record because that's 139.8 miles. Took the person 50 hours. You know, he can literally say, I swam all day. Twice. Plus 2. So it's 19 times longer. No one is going to swim from California to Hawaii. It's impossible. And so the illustration used to go like this. You try as hard as you could and swim as far as you could, and you wouldn't be able to make it, and so the grace boat comes and picks you up. And that gets you the rest of the way. Well, the problem with that, as you look at that, some obviously would get further than others, wouldn't they? You got this world record guy out at about 140 miles. You got some other people that, you know, maybe they're close. Maybe you got some 100-milers, definitely some 50, 25. Really, a mile would be a big cutoff. I think you'd have 10% of the world above a mile and 90% below. You'd have some people who couldn't swim, who never got past where they could touch, and some afraid of the water on the shore saying, no, I can't do it. You'd have that whole spectrum. Well, what would be then if this grace boat illustration worked, and they, whatever, had to send a little lifeboat in to get the people on shore? What would be the question that would be prevalent on the boat? If that's what it was like, everyone swam as far as they could, and the boat picked them up wherever it needed to, what would be the question that would be so common on the boat?
Have you seen any sharks?
Well, that might work there. You're trying to make the list of things I didn't think of, aren't you?
How much did you do?
Yeah, how far did you get? And what would be the effect if someone said, I went 140 miles? Someone else said, yeah, I never got past where I could touch.
Pride or shame?
Yeah, a person, I went 140 miles. How far did you go? I didn't get off the shore. Yeah, well, it's the same thing. Think about that. Apply that to salvation through Jesus' good deeds to get us up to 100. First of all, what's the problem with that? Remember I said you can't make up for good deeds? Every good deed you do, you owe. Jesus had no extra good deeds. He was Jesus. He was the Son of God. He had no extra. Every good thing he did, he was supposed to do. Every bad thing he didn't do, he was supposed to not do. Jesus had no extra good deeds. No one does. Well, the Catholic views the saints have extra good deeds. No one has extra good deeds. So that's impossible right there. But the problem with this idea is, if you believe that salvation is based on my personal active righteousness, in other words, my works, what we call legalism, legalism always, without fail, results in either pride or shame. If people live by legalism, and I would say this, to the degree they live by legalism, they have some understanding of grace, but it's tainted by legalism, they will be either prideful or shameful. If they think I'm doing it pretty well, I'm doing it well enough, they're going to be prideful. I'm doing it better than most. Definitely doing it better than you. You're going to have pride. And if they think they're not doing it well, maybe not doing it well enough, you're going to have shame. It always happens. I've seen it over and over and over. Matter of fact, you can have shame to the extent, and then one thing that's interesting is you can actually have prideful shame. You ever heard of that? You can have prideful shame. People who say, I'm so bad, I don't know if God can save me. What are you saying? It sounds humble, doesn't it? Oh, I'm just so bad. You're basically saying, I think I can sin better than God can save. I'm better at sinning than God is at saving. He can't pay that much of a price. He doesn't love that. His love isn't that good. Yeah, prideful shame. Prideful humility. Prideful something. Yeah, prideful shame. Yeah. And you see that. What kind of dynamic are you going to have in a church if you have some people thinking they're better than others, some people thinking they're worse than others? Terrible. You're not going to have the unity that is so essential to Christianity. I believe this is why the book of Romans was written. Because Paul heard the Jews and the Gentiles weren't getting along. They weren't united. And the reason was they both looked down on each other. The Jews thought, you Gentiles, you've been pagan sinners for generations. We're way better than you. We've got the law, we have the prophets. The Gentiles said, yeah, but we didn't kill Christ. At least we didn't ask for it. You're the one there. They both thought they were better than the others. And so Paul, he doesn't just say, hey, get along, no one's better than the other. He teaches grace. You're all equally lost. You all equally need salvation. And that's the same thing for us. When you view salvation as declared passive righteousness, that I owed 100% penalty and received 100% grace, we're all, to use the expression, in the same boat. Stop and think about it for a minute. I always try to find the best person, and the worst person examples I can. I think, still for everyone, no matter how old you are, Hitler pretty much personifies the worst. And Mother Teresa, you think about her, I think most people have heard about her, and she personifies the best. All the sacrifice she made. Hitler and Mother Teresa, were they equally sinful? Sinful, their actions. No. Hitler was much worse than Mother Teresa. They were not equally sinful. Were they equally lost? Yes. Because going back to, you sin once, it's as guilty as breaking it all. Which this goes to that question that often comes up. Are all sins the same? Are all sins equal? I heard a yeah. I see a head shake no. I see a... I'm going to hedge my... You know what? This person's right. If that's yes and no, it's right. Are all sins the same? Yes and no. We just said all sins the same. One sin, you're lost. You're eternally separated from God. Doesn't matter if it's lying about the cookie or committing mass murder. You have the same eternal fate. All sins are the same. But are they the same in another sense? No, because you look at the Old Testament where God gave the punishment for sins. And you notice he didn't just say, anyone who sins at all, put him to death. He said, if you murder, put him to death. If you steal, take back something plus extra. So they are and they aren't. They'll all separate us from God, but not all sins are equally sinful in that sense. And so you know what I like to do? A better illustration of grace, instead of the swimming to Hawaii thing, here's my illustration. Trying to be saved on your own efforts is like trying to long jump over a 100-foot pit. The world record for long jumping is 29 feet, 4.5 inches. So the best long jumper in the world can't do 100 feet. He's going to fall down into that pit. And for the sake of the illustration, you can't get out of the pit. But you don't fall hard enough that you break your leg or kill yourself, because that would get into those other things again. We don't want that. So there's that pit. Well, everyone's going to try to jump. Someone's going to do 29 feet. Other people are going to do 20 feet. 15, 10, a few of us are going to trip over the edge and just fall. But when it's all said and done, we're all down in the pit, aren't we? And we need the same amount of help to get out. We're all equally lost and equally need grace. That's what we need to understand. And so what happens then, finish up with this, what happens when I am saved? We said what happens when I sin? The double trouble. What happens when I'm saved? The double cure that Rock of Ages talks about. My guilt is forgiven immediately. God views me the moment I am forgiven, the moment I accept Christ, the moment I accept grace, as being not guilty. In his mind he viewed me as guilty. In his mind now he views me as not guilty. Before becoming a Christian, he viewed me as deserving and earning condemnation, eternal separation. Now he views me as not condemned, not owing that penalty anymore of eternal separation from him. I'm forgiveness. I'm justified. Some people like to define justified as just as if I'd never sinned. Again, not very precise. I would say just as if I'd already paid my penalty. God doesn't look at me and say, oh, you've never sinned. No, you have, but your penalty's paid now. Because what Jesus did on the cross. Glorification has another element. You have justification. You have glorification. It is going to be transforming our body. But at judgment, God's going to say, you get to spend eternity with me. So those two, and then there is the sinfulness. It's the moment I become a Christian, God gives me the indwelling gift of his Holy Spirit, and he begins to work on that sinfulness. It's certainly not done right away. It's going to be my whole life. But God works on that right away. So that's what it means to be lost. God views me as being guilty because I am guilty. I've sinned. He views me as owing the penalty for that sin, which is eternal separation from him. And we might think, well, that's not fair. I only sinned once. Maybe I even only sinned 10 or 100 times, but I didn't do something as bad as someone else. Why do I spend eternity? It is fair. Because God is 100% holy. He can have nothing to do with sin. One sin, whatever it is. I was lost. God now views me as being saved. You don't owe the penalty anymore. You didn't earn that. You can't earn it. But we receive it freely. That's grace. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk about how we receive that. What I want to do now, I always want to end with what do I need to do now. And so you look there, a couple things. First of all, examine my understanding. Is some of what I've heard today different than what I believe? Maybe you've heard something different for a long time. Didn't even realize it. I would ask you not to just accept it because I've said it. But I would ask you, as they did in the New Testament in Acts, search the Scriptures and see what it says. Ask questions. If you have questions and want to talk to me later, I'd be happy to talk about it. Whatever it is. And let's see what the Bible says. The other thing to do is examine my actions. Do my actions show or not, that I'm living by a right understanding of grace. And the main one is going to be, is there some element of pride that I think, you know what, I'm doing pretty well with this Christian life, I'm better than others. And you know what the fact is? You might be doing pretty well in one sense and better than others. But do I view that as any sense as the basis for my relationship with God? Now, I'm saved, I'm still in this relationship with God. Why? Because I'm doing so well at it. Now, does living a life more in line with what God wants affect the nature of our relationship with Him? Absolutely. But it doesn't determine whether I have a relationship with Him or not. And we're going to talk about that more when we talk about what it means to, or what it looks like to live the Christian life. So ask those questions, and here's what I would say. One thing to begin doing is read the Bible through this lens of grace. As you're reading it, how does this show me what it means to be lost? How does it show those two different types of righteousness? How does it show the attitude that I could have, that I should have? How does it show the wrong attitude that some people in the Bible did have? Begin seeing, because once again, if this is essential to Christianity, it's essential that we get it.